Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Vienna Gambit, which starts out with e4, e5, knight c3. After knight f6, white plays the move pawn f4. I like this because being a player that has played a lot of King's Gambit, anytime I can play e4 and f4, I just feel extremely comfortable. Now, the variations we are going to look at, one is if they counter in the center with d5. We'll also look at d6, pretty common line that black would play anytime white plays f4. And then we'll also look at the accepted line, the pawn takes on f4. So let's start with d5. Okay, they counterattack in the center of the board, but we're going to take on e5. Usually you're giving up the pawn on the f file. That is the gambit itself. So, hey, if they allow us to take material with our f pawn and we can attack our opponent's knight, that feels like a win. Now, as far as what they do with their knight, more than likely they need to just take here on e4. If they try to get too cute, knight to g4 because the knight is being defended by the bishop on c8, it doesn't really work out that well for them. We can just take with our pawn on d5. We have three central pawns. They have no central pawns. Now our queen is still attacking. Where do they really go from here? Maybe they take with their knight on e5, but then we could just play d4. We're completely controlling the center of the board. They're just going to be moving their knight around. We're going to play knight f3. We can get our light square bishop involved into the game, castle on the king side with our rook on the f file. They just really haven't done anything, and they don't have any of their central pawns. So I do think that more than likely they are just going to take on e4. And in this case, we can play d3. Now, you do have some other options as far as where you can go. I like d3 because it allows us to play some more of the trap lines. I always like to put my opponent in some difficult spots. Now, from here, I think you're going to see two options. One is if they just take with their knight on c3, and they could also play a line where they play queen to h4. So let's first look at the knight takes on c3. We're going to take with our pawn. Then I think they're more than likely going to play knight c6, getting more material involved into the game, attacking this pawn on e5. We're going to play knight f3. We need to get our own material involved as well as defend this pawn on e5. And then d4 from black. If they don't, I think that would be a mistake because then we can play d4. We can get our light square bishop involved, castle on the king side. I think we have a much better position. Part of the reason they're going to play knight to c6 is because, one, yes, it does attack here on e5, but allows them to push forward with d4. And this pawn's protected by the knight and the queen right here. From here, we're going to play just bishop e2, preparing to castle on the king side, and really start to put pressure on this f7 square. Now, if they don't play knight takes on c3, another option they could have is queen h4. Okay, yes, we're attacking their knight on e4, but now they have check, and we essentially have to play g3, and they could just take with their knight right here because we can't recapture. They could just take with their queen on h1. But after they play knight g3, we don't have to capture with our pawn. We can play knight f3. So yes, they can take our rook, but then we can take their queen. They don't have a lot of good options with their queen. They don't just want to come back off the h file because if they do, we just take their knight on g3. So more than likely, you're going to see queen h5. Queen on h6 would fall to our bishop on c1, so typically not going to see that. But now we have the move knight takes d5, and we are threatening knight takes on c7, and this is check. This is also forking the king and the rook on a8. Now they can take if they want to on h1. We can take on c7 as you would expect. Maybe king d8, we take on a8, and then bishop g4. We play bishop g2, attacking the knight and defending our own knight on f3. But even if they don't take on h1, they could just bring their bishop down to g4 right away. Well, we're going to go ahead and take on c7. And after the king moves, we could play bishop to g2. Yes, they could take our knight if they want to. That is fine. But we're kind of in this predicament of, okay, if you want to take our rook, we're going to take your rook. If you don't take our rook, we're not going to take your rook. But we do want to defend this f3 square. We need our bishop and our queen both defending that square. So that's what happens if we see d5 early on from our opponents. The next variation that we're going to look at is instead of d5, they could play d6. In this position, we are going to play knight f3, and they have a few options here. They could take on f4. They could get their light square bishop involved in the game. One of the reasons you play d6 is to have a solid pawn structure in the center, very defensive, and then get the light square bishop involved very, very quickly. They could also play more of a wait and see defensive approach with bishop to e7. This is a safer path, the castle on the king side. And yes, they may not be familiar with the Vienna Gambit, but it's very difficult for black to really get out of line with anything that white can do. So the first option is just the pawn takes on f4. Now, as soon as they do this, this is opening up for white to control the center of the board. So white has a couple options. They always have pawn d4, controlling the center with two central pawns and opening up for the dark square bishop to come to f4. So that's going to be priority numero uno. But white also has the option of bishop to c4. As soon as black has committed to the dark squares in the center, bishop to c4 always makes sense. This is if you played a lot of King's Gambit before, or just play f4 in general, preparing a castle on the king side, you want to get your material involved. We already have knight to f3, then light square bishop, castle on the king side, really prepare an attack on the f file. So bishop c4 does exactly that. Now, instead, if they don't take on f4, maybe they play bishop g4. Okay, well, now we can still just play bishop c4, or we can just play d4. We have both of those options. If instead they play more of a waiting move, bishop to e7, now I do recommend playing pawn d4. The reason for that is they're looking to castle on the king side. They're going to have king safety. Bishop c4 doesn't do as much. Still a very strong square for the bishop to go to, but just not as much as controlling the center of the board right away. Now, if they take, we have a couple options. We can take with our knight. We can take with our queen. So last thing we're going to look at is if instead of they play d6, they could also just take on f4. I do think this is one of the worst options just because we can just push forward with e5. And we're essentially forcing them to come back to g8. Yes, they could play queen to e7 and say, ha, I got you. You can't take with your pawn because that's pinned down. But then we just play queen e2. They look at the board and they realize, okay, now I have to play knight back to g8. And they're in a tough spot because we play d4 and we control the center of the board. Our dark square bishop can now come in, take on f4, and this is not going to be good for black. So really, after we play pawn e5, they're forced to come back to g8, and then we can play knight to f3. We can push forward with d4, get our light square bishop involved into the game, castle on the king side. This is exactly what we're looking for. When we give compensation in a gambit, we want a gain in tempo. We want to control the center of the board, and that's exactly what this variation does. So if they take, just push forward. You can see they have nothing developed on their board right now. We eventually are going to be able to take this pawn on f4, and we should have a pretty aggressive game. So this is the Vienna Gambit. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.